Hello, I'm John Kane, and this is Resistance Radio. I want to thank you for joining me again. It is, as always, it's a pleasure to be broadcasting in New York City on WBAI and in Washington D.C. on WPFW. Uh, look, the news cycle never ceases to give us plenty to talk about. But as you know, I try to talk about the stuff that not everybody else is talking about. So yeah, I could talk about Trump and his dementia showing up in Davos and all of that. But I'm sure others have done a um, a great job expanding that. What I will say is that you've got a guy who is seems to be obsessed with Greenland and must have only recently realized that Greenland has ice predominantly on it. And between his obsession with ice, his immigration army, and the idea that Greenland had ice on it, I think he got confused about what Iceland. I say Iceland is what he's trying to turn Minnesota into with his army, and although Greenland is what the island he's obsessed with, and of course we also know there's another island that he wants to distance himself from, as in Epstein Island, which probably has more of his name all over it than anything. So, but anyway, I won't spend the broadcast talking about that. What I will talk about though is, look, we oftentimes talk about social reckoning, and I want to talk a little bit about that because what I find is that there's very little of it. There's talk of it. I mean, there's always talk about this idea that well, we've got to reckon with the past, we've got to hold people accountable, we've got to own the history, and then it's not, and so I'm hoping to have a friend of mine join me for the program today, and when he does, we will. Look, here's the other thing I gotta say. I know that uh, there are social media platforms that are widely used to inform people, misinform people, to sway people, and I am among those people who use Facebook. Um, I actually use Facebook not just to inform the people who follow the work that I do, but also to sometimes engage in the people who don't agree with me. And I like that discourse. And I say that because when I get into a conversation with somebody on Facebook that doesn't agree with me, and it looks like it's going ugly, for one thing, I want people to understand. I have a certain theatrical flair that I call upon when I'm engaged in some of this stuff, and so I don't want anybody to try to infer from the words that I post and and the language that I use that I am just losing it, or that I'm angry, or or somehow upset. Some of it's theatrical, and I say that in advance because some of you will go back and you'll check some of the stuff. And but I use social media, and 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 I want to I really want to engage people, and I know that I have a certain following, both on to follow me on my profile page, but also I have the Let's Talk Native page. I have the Resistance Radio page, and of course, I do the show, right? Um, so I try to post commentary, and sometimes I'll take that commentary and I'll put it up as a Substack entry. I do a variety of things to try to initiate conversations. Unfortunately, a lot of times people will look at my posts and agree with them or give me a like, but they don't have a whole lot of conversation. And look, and sometimes I do get conversations, I do get responses that I will partially disagree with, and I had that happen this week. Um, but I also have people who post videos and commentary from others, and I'll start off by talking about one of the engagements that I had. And we've heard this many times before about how the U.S. Constitution was based on the ideology and the political systems of the Haudenosaunee. Um, the problem is that's not true. here's what I will say, and somebody did post. Ben Romero had a piece where he's trying to educate people, about the origins of the U.S. Constitution, and he says some of those same old tropes that was based, almost singularly or wholly or in large part on the philosophies and the political system of the Haudenosaunee. Um, and it's simply not true. And so I challenged that. I said, well, it's mostly not true because a lot of times they'll talk about matriarchy, they'll talk about the power vested in clan mothers, and they misconstrue the whole notion of equity and equality and that kind of stuff. So I challenged what he had said, and then I had somebody do a full front engagement saying, well, I think you're wrong. And this was a non-native person who is an amateur researcher, I guess, who said that she found that both the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution were entirely based on the ﷺ Wampum, or what we call the ﷺ or Ꭿဿဿ, and the ЇΕ, or what some people might know as the Great Law of Peace. Doesn't really translate to that, but I'll leave it there. And we went back and forth a little bit, and she got really angry, and at some point called me a racist, and then deleted all her comments. But I think these are conversations to have, because here's the thing. Here's what I will say about the founding fathers of the United States. They did see and realize that the Haudenosaunee, the 5 nations and eventually 6 nations, had a union. We had formed a union that they were envious of. In fact, Ben Franklin, I quote this in our film, The Long Hope, that he basically called us, how is it that 6 nations of ignorant savages could form a union that seems indissoluble, when a dozen or more Englishmen can't seem to do this. So he expressed, in a way, in a condescending or at least a sarcastic way, to his audience, that a bunch of ignorant savages had been able to form a union that seemed to last forever, as far as they were concerned, and yet they couldn't seem to muster that level of agreement. So they were envious. So I will say that the founding fathers, Ben Franklin in particular, but others, as they learned more about who we were, they understand this idea of a union where the parties all had had equality. The people within those nations had equality, and that there was no real centralized king or master, grand chief or anything else. I know people will argue that, but so I think they were envious of it, and so I think they may have been influenced by the notion that we existed, but I got to tell you, the influence almost stops there. Obviously, the U.S. Constitution and much of the language. I mean, we were called merciless Indian savages in the Declaration of Independence. It's hard to suggest that they were modeling their independence off of us when they thought we were nothing but merciless Indian savages. And not to mention, one of the passages in the Declaration of Independence was clearly a complaint against the King of England for not allowing them to bring in more immigrants and take more native lands. So, I mean, but anyway, I mean, these are the kind of discourses that I don't mind having, and I almost wish she hadn't taken her post down, because I would have rather people see the progression of the conversation. But having said that, let me now introduce my friend. I've got my friend David Harmony, who we go back a bit here. We've been working together on a number of projects, not the least of which is that he's helped me with some of my postings on YouTube and on Facebook, and we've been working on a timeline together. But David also posts and adds commentary on my pages, and to that I am very appreciative, because I think he adds to the content. I will say not everybody gives me really substantive content, but David is among them. So David, I will welcome you to the program, and I want to thank you for joining me.
Hey, thanks, John. Yeah, there's no shortage of content these days.
No, there certainly is plenty that that there's plenty to choose from. But you posted something today, and I want to start the conversation with that. Or I think you posted
okay.
today. You posted about this holy book at one of these churches, I guess, that Yeah, and we've known of this and other instances where native flesh has been used for everything from making pouches and book covers, Bible covers. This isn't a Bible. This is basically, I think it's a book that describes the history of Christianity in Latin, and
Hmm.
it's a much revered book, but it was covered, maybe not originally, and I don't know if it's an original cover, but the cover of this book, which is on display, and it's a much revered book, is made of human leather. It was leather that was flayed from a native person and used to put the covering on this book. Now I know it's not unusual for old books to have leather covers, but it's a little unusual to have a book made of human flesh. And so you posted this, and I don't know if you want to elaborate a little bit on what you posted.
Boy, that sounds really gross. Two
Yeah, it
words
does.
that
It is
shouldn't be
gross.
stitched together,
Yeah.
literally. Yep. Um, well, I think looking at the history here, the book was written in the late 1700s, and it was wrapped up and celebrated soon thereafter, and it found its way over to the Ilith School of Theology around 1893, if I'm reading this correctly.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then our good friend Tinker joined that program, and a year in, they finally let him in. They clued him in because it was very hush hush, one of those don't mention societies, as they celebrated the book, and it was right at the entrance of the school, which is gross in itself. Yeah. Anyway, I've made contact with Tank recently, and he shared this documentary that he did a couple of years ago. I think it's a good production on a gross topic, and I think one of the key points that you mentioned in the post, and that's we know each other, John, right?
Yeah.
I'm always trying to get you speaking and get others contributing. We know it's far bigger than this. No matter how grotesque this particular example is, um, as you chimed in, there's so many other examples from day one since contact. So, yeah, I think it's important to keep these issues front and center. I think interesting in that PBS documentary was the action plan, which called for a certain amount of action and ownership from the school before they would take the book. Um, I don't know how much leverage that really is. I thought that was a little odd or interesting. But in the end, the ball is in their court. They have some ownership to take, and they have to continue doing things like that documentary to broaden the awareness and the sensitivities around the issues, which are far greater than that one. So,
Well, and here's, I guess, the language that caught me was where they suggested that it was they were coming to terms with this awful past, and I'm sorry, I just don't see it. I just don't see this idea of coming to terms with the past. In fact, there's such obvious denial about much of that past that I think it ends up being very problematic as far as I can see. And this leads me to a post that I had put up where I talked about the you know the I hear a lot of people today saying that much of the conflict that exists in the United States right now has its origins in the Civil War and this battle between North and South and the ideologies of the North and the ideologies of the South and of course this turns into Democrat and Republican, which kind of they actually kind of switch in many ways, who was more uh, geared towards human rights and who was more geared towards states' rights and that kind of stuff. But so there's all this, but by trying to suggest that much of the tensions that exist in the United States today go straight back to the Civil War, and I don't disagree that there was never a proper accounting or a coming to terms with the treason and the secession and the racism, and in fact, the South got a pass. I mean, they got a clear pass from the North. Nobody was ever prosecuted, and in fact, the South gained a lot of power. And of course, the South had power from the get go, and I think this is where I talk about trying to come to terms. Look, the U.S. Constitution enabled the South to have representation that was beyond their population. And they did that by allowing the South to count their enslaved human beings not as citizens, but as three-fifths of a man for the purposes of apportionment of congressional representation. Not to mention the fact that the apportionment of Senate seats is just two per state, regardless of population. So it is the antithesis of democracy if you're going to say that a state like Alabama or the Dakotas, for instance, that don't have a big population, Montana, should have as many Senate seats as say California or New York, and just based on population. So there's all and I said Montana, even though it's not really a southern state, but many of the southern states have smaller populations than the northern states, but they have disproportionate amount of Senate representation. Of course, without even getting into gerrymandering that would follow after after the whole three-fifths compromise thing kind of went away. There was always this effort to make sure that the South maintained a certain amount of power in terms of representation in the government. So yeah, there's a lot of problems that are built into the Constitution, built into the whole thing. But my point in doing this observation about the North and the South, the right and the left, the Republicans and Democrats, is that there was one area that they were pretty much united in, and this goes all the way back to the origins, and it's before Civil War. Because I had somebody suggest that, look, the United States didn't really turn its attention towards genocide of Native people till after the Civil War, till after abolition, and I said, oh, that's not true. This is again one of these conversations on Facebook that I was having. And I thought it was important to realize that genocide against Native people, I mean, frankly, including enslavement. I mean, the first slaves in the Western Hemisphere were the Native people. It wasn't Africans that were hauled over here. So when you look at the history, you realize that regardless of political leanings or the geography of where somebody was located, north or south, it was a pretty unified effort to dispossess Native people. Now, granted, the South was all about dispossession so they could bring in enslaved human beings to work the land. But and somebody says, well, clearly, the North got their way because slavery was dismantled. And I say, well, if you look at who the billionaires are, who the people who have the disproportionate amount of money in the United States, I would argue that they are the predominant landholders, plantation owners, if you will, and the people who are working the land are not those people. They are people who are maybe not enslaved technically, but I think they are financially enslaved. And among that population, ironically, is a large proportion of immigrant labor, legal and otherwise, as the United States calls it. So, I think it's important that people really understand the history. You can't simplify this by end of slavery, North versus South, Republican versus Democrat, because from a Native perspective, we have seen this come from across the political spectrum. So, and I know you saw some of that the discourse that I had on that posting.
I enjoy it. Yeah, clearly. And as you know, John, I'm just slightly younger than you, but perhaps a bit more tuned in to the technologic craziness and the short attention spans.
Well, that's because you were slightly younger than me. Yeah.
Well, it's more so because I'm a techie.
Well, that too, yeah.
I know that you get less than 2 minutes, probably less than 30 seconds these days, and so I'm always encouraging you. Okay, what's the call to action? What's the summary? What are the cliff notes, right? And just listening to what you just said, I'll probably get this wrong, but the first 250 of 500 years was acquire the land by any means, and then that got a little brutal, so they started legislating, and so the second, I don't know, maybe the next 80 years were okay. Let's have a nicer version of that. Let's legislate. Let's pacify. Let's patronize the original. We were not owners, the original stewards, and then from there, after the Civil War, following what you said, it's like, well, no, now the battle is, now that we have the land, it's how do we use the land? So if you could call them morals, they changed over time. the
See, now,
beginning
and
just
on
to
that,
agree to get the land, and then later,
I
yeah,
don't completely agree there because I think that certain strategies changed, but they still were pretty much concentrated on the same thing. So I think when we think about the morality changing, and we're going to talk about this piece that you and I were going back and forth with over from Maggie Blackhawk because I think it captures some of that. But I do agree with you. The policies changed, um, but previous policies never fully went away. So when we talk about things like extermination, for instance, I mean obviously the first policy of the United States was to kill Native people. Um, and of course, then it gets into removal and assimilation and termination and all of these classifications of policies, right? But some of them overlap and don't ever come to a complete end. So if we look at post Civil War, when the residential schools, for instance, became a prominent native American philosophy towards Native people, that still involved the elimination of life. I mean, kill the Indian, save the man. I say it in my film. It's not just a metaphor. Metaphors don't require graveyards. So I understand what you're saying, and I agree that on paper they suggested that they had to have a more humanitarian view of how to deal with Native people. But keep in mind, by the time they get there, David, let's be honest. They've eliminated, they've depopulated the landscape to the tune of 90%. I mean, they've already almost completely wiped out the population, and many peoples did cease to exist. So, I think the idea of trying to have a gentler and kinder way of dealing with the quote unquote Indian problem was because they thought they were well on their way. And obviously, the residential school thing. I mean, if you take our children and you kill the native part of their identity, then you, for all intents and purposes, if you are completely successful, you've wiped out the population, at least in terms of an ethnic cleansing standpoint, if not a complete depopulation. So I don't know. I don't know if I really disagree with you, but I kind of
so I've
disagree
got
with you.
I have a clarification and an edgy
Okay, go
follow up,
ahead.
like I always do. I agree with you. And what I was suggesting was more so from the biased perspective of the United States itself. Yes, they've always had the same game plan for us. I was saying more so, okay, if we are out of the mix, if we're just a pesky 10% remaining, right? And they've sufficiently silenced us and shamed us and shut us down mentally, then what's left? Well, we got to win over back then 30-40% of the remaining population, which we've done horrible crap to as well, right?
Yeah.
So what I was speaking to was more so, okay, it's no longer about brutality, it's legislative lethality, like Stephen talks about, right? So now
Right.
we're into the lethality mode. But furthermore, within that, post Civil War, it shifted towards proper use of resources, and you know how I feel about that word, and that was a post recently.
Well, part of their
Um,
justification,
so they're
part of their
constantly
justification
redoing
all
their
along
image.
was that we weren't using the land effectively. So part of the justification for removal and dispossession of land was to say we were wasting it, because we were preserving it rather than putting it to the Protestant Christian
Yeah, to great
values
use,
use.
right?
Yeah, yeah,
Doing what we did to beautiful people, slavery. Yes,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
yes, that's a much better use, isn't it, John?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So and I think the two conversations, both posts, because of this idea of kind of coming a reckoning, so to speak, leads me back to this piece that I sent you. And as you know, the film, the Long Hope, is all about trying to expose the three primary legal doctrines that are used against Native people, and of course, and these all come from the same place. Chief Justice John Marshall, the longest serving Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, who served in the early 1800s. and he codified into law something that was already established by the church, which was called the doctrine of Christian discovery. But he embedded it and codified it into U.S. law, and used it as a rationale for suggesting, in spite of the fact that we had treaties that said otherwise, by the way, suggesting that we never really held title to land, that we never owned the land. It was always just we were like the animals. We just happened to be there, and we could be driven off just like animals could be. But we had a certain right of occupancy, but we didn't hold title to land. So that was what John Marshall decided with the doctrine of Christian discovery. But in also what he did was he went further with that and said that this idea of claiming title to our lands and discovering our lands was tantamount to conquering the lands and conquering the people on them. So he equated conquest with discovery. And in doing so, suggested that our sovereignty was necessarily diminished upon discovery. I mean, I'm not saying over time. He said upon discovery that our sovereignty was diminished, and that we had been reduced to like children, and that we were like wards or to a guardian, and so out of the doctrine of Christian discovery, he develops this other doctrine that he calls the trust doctrine, which has the United States appointing themselves as our trustees and designating us as wards. Now, this is where I got to be a little bit clear here. So when I say us, I'm saying that in this designation, all native peoples, all of the peoples that predated European contact and the United States, because we get into this conversation about race, right? And I'm not even suggesting that we are a race of people. I'm just saying that we are the people that predated all of this colonization. But so what John Marshall was suggesting was that all of us, regardless of our diversity, where we lived, how we lived, our governmental structures, arguably, what by a white man's standard, what level of sophistication we had somehow developed, regardless of it all, we are all considered wards of the federal government. And in suggesting this, that we were not just wards of the federal government, but by being thrown into this American purgatory, we were essentially reduced to a subclass of human existence within the United States. And so that's the trust doctrine. And of course, the one that becomes very problematic is the final one that they call the plenary powers doctrine, which is where, again, Chief Justice John Marshall and every court since then has suggested that Congress has been granted absolute power over Native peoples. And the whole concept of plenary powers, there are many different, there are several types of it. And from a Native standpoint, we always talk about Congress having plenary powers. But there's also this argument, in fact, Stephen Miller raised the issue about the president's plenary powers. And of course, there's nothing, and this is what I have to say, there's nothing in the Constitution that suggests any, including the Supreme Court that developed this thing, has absolute authority. I mean, there's nothing in the Constitution that grants absolute authority to any of the three branches of government. And yet, we see the Supreme Court doing it, we see the president, the executive branch claiming it, and we see Congress claiming it, especially as it relates to Native people. So these are the three that we take on in the film. But here's what I learned. Since producing the film, since getting it out and getting it around, that we've ruffled some feathers. And among the feathers that we've ruffled are Native feathers. And there are Native people who kind of embrace the notion of plenary powers. And for a variety of reasons. And we can get into a little bit of that. But one of the greatest examples of the machinations that Native scholars, especially Native legal scholars, is this piece that was sent to me by Peter Dorico from Maggie Blackhawk. And it's basically an article or thesis or whatever you want to call it about the constitution of colonialism, not big C, but the idea of constituting the whole idea of colonialism versus big C, the Constitution. And so she does this whole thing, and she starts out, I think, pretty effectively talking about how this notion of creating, what did she say? That The United States holds hundreds of governments in subordination, not historically, today. It dominates these governments and their peoples, exploits their resources, prohibits political independence, withholds representation, and imposes its own laws, values, and norms upon these governments without consent. So I'm thinking, oh, this is going to be good. I mean, she's talking my language, is what I'm thinking, right? But as you and I
Mhm.
both went through this thing, we started to see her use of things like always referring to the government as our government, meaning her government. So she was counting herself throughout the article as essentially one of them. But what she does, but one of the things that she does clearly, and I think effectively, is talk about the fact that the Constitution of the United States is inward looking. It's about how they create the government and the protections for the people within the United States, within the established colony, so to speak. But it doesn't address colonialism. It doesn't address imperialism. So what she says is there's like two. There's the Constitution Big C, which is inward looking, and then there's what she calls small c, the Constitution of imperialism or colonialism, which is outward looking, which is authoritarian, which is done through force and violence and all kinds of other stuff. And but what she tries to struggle with, and David, correct me if you read this differently than me, but what she struggles with is how do you take the small c constitution of colonialism and somehow incorporate it in the big C U.S. Constitution of the that's supposed to be about protecting people rather than subjugating people. So I mean, is that about the way you read some of this?
Yeah, and that's one of the things that agitated me. I mentioned to you that she's using a technique called boxing. She's boxing in, creating an inside and an outside reality when really neither actually exist. Just talking your way in circles creates the box, right? In her words, she said, the ability to better mitigate American colonialism, I argue, as well as a broader vision of constitutionalism. Okay, you know what I meant?
Yep.
One that presses beyond the erroneous limit between internal and external constitutionalism toward questions over community, formation, expansion, and consent that rest within our constitutional borderlands. Blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
She's basically saying that would be the result of such a long overdue reckoning. But again, it's just concepts. It's linguistic doublespeak. What existed before the Constitution? Original free existence.
Well, and
Right?
you see, that's where
And if you don't mind, yeah,
that's where she never is able to get back
go ahead.
to. She's trying to look forward through a lens that's only going to be a lens about the United States, their government,
Within the
their
game.
constitution. She has no ability to say, okay,
Yeah.
if all of this stuff was done and was created wrongly through force and the absence of freedom and rights and that kind of stuff, she never ventures to go back to what could have existed before. In fact, let's be honest here. Even though I think the United States committed fraud with almost every treaty it ever negotiated with Native people, because I don't think they ever intended to live up to their arrangements. The fact is that they did negotiate treaties, so they did it at least on the from a window dressing standpoint to acknowledge our free and independent existence, and then oftentimes tried to coerce, or sometimes through force and other means, um, some capitulation on our side. So I don't think treaty negotiations were ever even handed, and they never served us. They always served the aggressor, the United States. But they at least went through the motions, legally from a legal standpoint, of saying, okay, we're going to do this thing with some protocol, the same protocol that we would essentially engage other sovereign nations with. So they went that direction, even though I think much of it was fraud. But she doesn't even address that in any of this stuff. I mean, she literally suggests that the United States did not engage in a structured mass campaign to remove, detain, assimilate, destroy these governments and their peoples in the name of civilization, but rather create this notion of federal Indian law. And I said, no, that's absolutely what they did. I mean, they absolutely did it in the name of civilization, and they said it. They said it over and over and over again. So I mean, I go through this thing, and on every step I find her, you know, saying thing. I mean, she's got this one line. She says, "But the Constitution would also provide the national government with the power to govern others, quote unquote, Indians, in spaces of liberal Constitution exception." No, they didn't. There's nothing in the Constitution, the big C Constitution that she's talking about, that did any of that. So, and here's the problem that I have, David. And this is what you and I are always wrestling with. She's a professor of law at NYU. I mean, she's an accredited law professor, law scholar, and even though she raises, I think, some really solid arguments about the unconstitutionality of colonialism, her whole effort is about, well, how do we bring it in? How do we bring it in and make it nice or something like that? And you know, she even admits
She's
to filing a
she's
brief that,
operating within that set of rules.
well,
Yeah.
she even admits to writing a brief that she acknowledges was a lie. I mean, did you see that piece where she actually said that? I mean, I don't remember how she worded it exactly. She said, as an author, let me got glasses here. Sorry. As an author of one of these briefs, I am free to admit the lie. So she actually submitted a brief that she now will admit was a lie, although she doesn't detail what the lie was. So, you know, and here's the thing. So when we talk about influential people, so this is Maggie Blackhawk. Her husband is Ned Blackhawk, who is also a law professor, who is also a legal scholar and a publisher of bestseller books and that kind of stuff. So when you got, you know, just a couple of guys self-funding a film on the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation, trying to build a little momentum towards challenging plenary powers, when these folks are going to say that in the overall scheme of things, it's been a positive thing, that it's somehow protected. I mean, she literally suggests that by having this plenary powers, they never had to address the constitutionality or the unconstitutionality of our treatment. So they never had to totally um, subjugate us. They were allowed. It allowed them, with their use of plenary powers, to kind of leave us alone a little bit. So we were able to still maintain a level of autonomy, even though they got to dictate what that autonomy was. She has a whole paragraph, which is essentially her justification for this, and saying, so in many ways, the plenary powers did offer us a level of isolation and seclusion that allowed some of our culture to be sustained. And I'm thinking, that's really the way you're interpreting this thing. And David, this is
It almost
where I lose my mind, is because these are the people who have more influence than you know, guys like yourself or
mhm.
I on social media or on YouTube or anyplace else.
People who should be our best representatives within the system, keeping in mind that our goal all along has been just leave us alone so we can live our original natural way, right?
Well,
We don't
because she
want to
never
live our
gets
life
there,
in the
right?
courts, so please
She
represent us.
she
Yeah.
never gets back to the place where she can say, okay, if all these things that were done to us, and I mean, she is very thorough in listing all the terrible things that they did. And, well, she's fairly thorough, put it that way. But she never says the solution is, you know, for one thing, to even acknowledge the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which is pretty much a tepid response, but she doesn't even go there. She never addresses the idea that our free and independent existence can once again be recognized. She never gets there. She's always still trying to put us in, again, in those boxes, or, you know, take us out of the one box that can't be justified, which is American imperialism, which continues to this day. Obviously, if you look at, you know, some of the language coming out of Trump. But so she wants to
I,
continue that, but she says we as Native people, because now this is where she'll jump ship, and she'll consider herself one of we instead of one of them. That, you know, that somehow we've got to be fully embraced by the U.S. Constitution. Now, I offered this to you to take a look at, because I guess my question is, when I see stuff like this and I read parts of the stuff that I think, well, she almost was getting it, and and of course, the more I read it, the more I realize, nah, she didn't. But I question whether somebody or people like her who are on the fence about what it means to be Native today. It doesn't mean to be American. Obviously, that's where she's at. She's it's our Constitution, it's our government, it's our federalism. That's what she says throughout the document. But can she start to say theirs, and can she start to acknowledge that there is an us and them, and it's not about racism, it's not about superiority, it's about distinction. Because one of the things that she concentrated on was that case, the Indian child welfare case, the ~̓ʰaʰīn case, and and she talked about the fact that they passed the Indian Child Welfare Act because their research, like they didn't know this already, right? Their research had shown that hundreds of thousands of kids were being ripped from their homes through child protective services. And that didn't even address the residential schools. This was just through CPS. And so they passed this law to try to put a stop to that. But nowhere in the law do they recognize our authority. In the law, they said they sought to empower. In fact, that's the word they use, sought. They sought to empower Native governments to take more control of child protective or child and family services. But there's nothing that's legislated there. I mean, there's nothing that forces the states or the federal government, the courts at any level, that forces them to acknowledge our authority and our rights over our own children. And she never even points that out. And yet, this is a lot of times the Indian Child Welfare Act is their justification for the plenary powers doctrine. So go ahead.
I have some empathy. I've lived my entire life in the pastures of the colonial project. I'm not even on the fence most days. Thankfully, I won't go into the detail here, but I have enough awareness of what's on the other side of that fence to continue your analogy. I don't think she's on the fence. I think she fell off long ago. And
I agree.
Pasture with the cows. Yeah, and I think here's an example. Passage 44 in her essay. It's just a couple sentences, but the key thing I'm picking up on, and that we could listen for, she's very passively trying to build a bridge between the colonial constitutional project and kind of hinting that there might be some way back to free existence, but she doesn't go there boldly. Of course, when you and I text each other, I do word swaps and emphasize, right? Certain things. I think this is really what she meant. She says, unless we recognize colonialism as a distinctive struggle of fundamental practices, norms, and institutions in our reality called society, and recognize the discourses around power, self-determination, sovereignty, jurisdiction, and community as a distinctive form of discourse, if we don't do that, then we leave the strategies that mitigate the American colonial project at risk of constitutional challenge. So I think she's kind of saying, yeah, I remember what it used to be like to live in community, to actually have original free existence. No need for your self-determination. Thank you. But we got to go there. We've got to talk about what you've done and your antics globally before we stand a chance of fixing our own mess.
Well, and what she's really saying, though, I mean, what she's saying here is that it can't withstand constitutional challenge. That's why she's saying if we don't understand that, if we don't even look at that picture of community, then what she says that the American colonial project is at risk of constitutional challenge because it won't hold up, and so she knows that, and yet in the very next line she goes on to talk about how they dealt with enslavement and Jim Crow and that they could legislate fixes for those things, but she doesn't really talk about how that's not really possible for a people who are not. I mean, she does a lot of this racial stuff, right? She says racial over and over and over again. And only one place does she mention the very concept of our political distinction. So that's where it's problematic, right? Because she knows that racial challenges won't hold up with or isn't constitutional, right? The whole idea of
Hmm.
equal application of law, the 14th Amendment, and all of that stuff. So she knows it doesn't hold up, but she still won't go where she needs to go in terms of understanding that we are not a racial group, that we are a distinct political group. Not because we have distinct political governments, but because we pre-exist this distinct political government that is oppressing us. And that's where I mean, you're great. It's great to point that out because it's like she knows, and that's why I say, you're right. She isn't really on the fence, but every once in a while, she'll like peek through the fence. You know what I'm saying? And she'll say, "Yeah, I see that
Yep.
over there.
Yep.
I can't get there, but I see it." You know what I mean?
And you get infected, right? It's like a disease.
Yeah.
We catch it if we linger too long on one side of the fence. So
Well,
it's tricky. I empathize with her.
well, and an example of that is the Indian Child Welfare Act. Look, our people recognized a huge problem. Not only did residential schools basically, strategize an attack on our children, but so did Child Protective Services. So we saw the problem, and yet the only solution we could come up with is the federal government protect us in a way that is, again, not constitutional because they basically have to create a law. And look, I think it was Kavanaugh who said, look, we would never say that white people have to have a priority in adopting white children, or that Latin Americans, should. So why would we do it here? I mean, his problem is the equal application of law, and it's because unlike what we would say about white people or black people or Hispanic people who have come to the United States willingly, oftentimes, or accept their U.S. citizenship willingly, they are accepting the fact that legislation has to be done, has to be equal. But we're saying we're distinct people, so you can't take your equal application of law and standards and throw us into the mix of your general population. And this is where the Maggie Blackhawks and the Ned Blackhawks and so many other of these legal scholars. And look, I learned of Maggie Blackhawk through being in direct conversation with one of the law professors from NYU in the first place. So this is the challenge that we have with The Long Hope. And let me mention again, the film that Ross John and I and Ross's wife Holly we produced is called The Long Hope. It's a full feature documentary on these, and they are racist. Don't make no mistake about it. Even though I don't consider ourselves a race, the idea that we were designated as a race. Look, like I said in the beginning of the program, the idea that you could take a huge mass of people, originally anyway, although our population was greatly diminished, that represent a thousand distinct cultures and peoples, and throw us into one box and call us Indians or American Indians or Native Americans, and then create this designation as a subclass of American existence or human existence by calling us wards of the state, and that in this one singular instance, and it's the only place in the United States, that a branch of government has been granted, not through the Constitution, but through legislative or actually adjudicated power to have absolute power over this people. I mean, that's an amazing thing in of itself. And Maggie never quite goes there, right? She's just saying, well, plenary
Hmm.
powers was the solution. She doesn't even really address whether it was lawful or not. So it's pretty incredible.
Well, John, one of the things that I've really been thinking on since I met you, um, geez, I'm losing track. Met you personally a couple of years ago, but I've been stalking you for more than that. Um, the I think we need to recoin the phrase martial law. Um, no, I think John Marshall did it. He created intentional legislative amnesia through what I now call the Trinity of the Chain,
You're right.
right? Those three laws. Um, and it all began with a religious belief system that is hierarchical and says, no, somebody's always got to be more powerful and on top. And so that became a basis for saying, well, of course, Europe is more evolved. So when we lay eyes on you, it's ours. You're just primitive, right? So
Superior genius
that
of
would be the
Europe
doctrine
is
of
what John
discovery.
Marshall called it, right? The superior genius of Europe.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And yet they're consulting us. How the heck do you guys do this?
Yeah,
How are you
exactly.
guys? How do you guys live so free and so well? Yeah, okay. Apparently they weren't that evolved.
No.
Um, and then the second doctrine being the trust. Well, John, I know you to be an incredibly responsible, diligent person. If I kicked you out of your home, if I came in with a military force and kicked you out overnight and quarantined you into a building with no access to food supply, I'll stop there in the example. I've effectively made you dependent on me. I made you a ward of my mental state, so to speak, right? So that is another form of amnesia. We used to know how to take care of ourselves, but we were intentionally disabled in that regard,
Right.
right? And that is not acceptable. And then the final one, okay, well, building upon the prior two, well, since I made you a ward, totally reliant on me, and my God is better than yours, so to speak, right? I had divine authority from day one. The amnesia is kicking in, and we're like, so now we're clamoring to be saved by those who did the abuse.
Yeah.
Plenary authority basically says, okay, now that I totally got you cornered, you're mine. You do what I say.
Right.
So Trinity of the chain, right, and martial law is what we have now.
Well, the funny thing is that, and
restate the
I
definition.
oftentimes have to check myself on spelling because martial law is with a TIAL, martial. The notion of martial law, but
I'm
the
playing
idea
with
that
words, John.
Marshall's laws and his rulings are what created, essentially martial law over Native people. So no, it's a great. I know you love
I like to
you
play
love
with
messing
words.
around with their language, and so I just wanted to, because
Oh, I really
I
do.
oftentimes forget how they how they contrive things and how they manipulate their language. And so one of the things that you are always suggesting is that we manipulate it right back. So and that's what we do. Look, we're just about out of
Yep.
time. David, I want to thank you for joining me. It is it's great to have you sitting with me, and I look forward to doing it again. Our work continues. We have much to do, and unfortunately, we've always got to be careful how much we let the work of other people influence what we're doing. And I think I've got a pretty good handle on being able to read something like Maggie's work or Ned's work or the people that I really truly admire and agree with, like Peter DeRico and Stephen Newcomb, and understand where it is that the conversation needs to go. And one of the things that that Peter and Stephen really dwell on is that this is less about just overt racism and more about a specific application of domination over Native peoples. And I think and the thing is, and they're quick to bring up that they've now tried to strike the religious overtones, but they always go back to the same place. So again, I want to thank everybody for listening and joining David and I for the program. It's always a pleasure to broadcast in Washington on WPFW and in New York on WBAI. I look forward to speaking with you next week. This is John Kane, and this is Resistance Radio. Yahweh.